everybody, today we're working on the N54. We're getting close to being able to put this back together and put it back in the car. My FCP Euro order finally arrived with the new rod bearings, the new rod bolts, and the oil pan bolts. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the rod bearings on this. I'm going to show you how to Plasti-gauge it and torque down the rod bolts, and then we're going to put the oil pump back on and the oil pan on. And then we'll be ready to do the front and rear main seal and the valve cover gasket and the rest of the gaskets, so that way we can get everything transferred onto this motor and back in the car. So I got the oil pan off. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to take off the oil pump and get access to the connecting rod, so that way we can change the bearings. So I'm going to take off these, and remember, these are one-time use bolts, the rod bolts and the bolts that hold on the oil pump. So make sure you get a kit to replace those if you're going to do this job. So I'm removing this bolt that holds on the oil pump sprocket. And what I'm going to do is, once I get this oil pump off, I'm just going to zip tie this through the middle onto this bracket. That way it can still spin when you're turning the crank, but it doesn't fall off of the chain or anything like that. So I'm going to get the rest of these bolts out and these bolts and remove the oil pump in this, and then I should have access to the connecting rods. So it looks like this bolt actually broke, so we're going to have to remove it. So you don't want to make this too tight, but just enough to kind of hold it in place. And then that way it could still spin, and we're good to go. So now we have access to all 6 connecting rods, and so we can kind of go in here and do them one by one. So I'm going to be using Plasti-gauge, but we're going to start by trying to remove this bolt, which it looks like we won't have to do any drilling, thankfully. So we're able to get this out, no problem. So this bolt here holding the oil pump in there actually broke, so we were able to get it out no problem. Didn't have to drill it or anything. So next we'll start taking off these, we'll go one by one, Plasti-gauge, and do the rod bearings. Alright, so we're starting with cylinder number 1. We got an E12 Torx. We're going to crack these loose. So we're actually going to save these bolts to do the Plasti-gauge, and then we'll use the new OEM bolts when we do the final assembly. So definitely some wear on these, but the crank feels fine, so it's good that we're changing these. So we're using the King bearings on these. So I'm going to do a dry fit first with the Plasti-gauge. So I'm going to clean this off with some brake clean and a microfiber towel, and then we'll put the Plasti-gauge on there and torque it down with the old bolts. And then we'll see where we're at. And we'll do that for each one. Each journal has a little specific way that it goes. It's not reversible or anything, so make sure that this lines up here, and then the same thing on the connecting rod. So I turn the crank a little bit, and I push the piston down, so that way I can get it around the crank. And then just make sure that you watch out not to hit the rod on the actual crank. And so now I've got better access to get this bearing out. So I've got this rod bearing in. I'm going to dry fit it on there. So now I'm going to turn the crank back, or I'm going to push this down so I can turn the crank back and get these torqued down with the Plasti-gauge. So I'm just giving it a good wipe before I put the Plasti-gauge on there, and then so now we'll put the rod cap back on. We've got the Plasti-gauge in there, so we'll gently set it in there. And then we'll dip the old rod bolts in some good quality oil. That way we can get the most accurate torque spec. And we'll thread them in by hand. And then you will torque these to 20 Newton meters. And then you'll do 70 degrees and then 70 degrees. So I've got my torque wrench set to 20 Newton meters, and then I'll do the 70 degrees on each side. So I've got it at 20, now I'm going to do the first set of 70. So we did the first 70, doing the second 70 now. So now we can break these loose and check the Plasti-gauge. And then you'll want to discard these bolts after. It's not a good idea. They've already been stretched twice, so you'll have no use for them. So now I can use this measuring tool to see where we're at. And we're at a little under 0.0015. In millimeters, we're at 0.051. So that's pretty good for what we're looking for. So we're within spec. So now I'm going to use some brake clean and clean that off of the rod cap and the journal, and then I'll do the final installation where I actually put some assembly lube and the new rod bolts. So I'm going to be using this red line assembly lube, and basically what you want to do is you want to make sure that the connecting rod and the actual connecting rod cap are clean and free of any oil, and then also the outside of the bearing should also be clean, and then the inside of the bearing that touches the journal should be lubed up very generously, and also the journal should be lubed up generously. That way the bearing stays inside. So remember to dip your rod bolts in some good quality oil. That way you can make sure that you get the most accurate torque readings when you're torquing down these bolts. So you can actually feel the bolts stretching as you're torquing them down. But it might feel like they're going to break, but it's not. That's just the bolt stretching and how it feels. So once you get them torqued down to 20 Newton meters in 2 rounds of 70 degrees, that's it. So I'll get the rest of these done. I'll probably time lapse that and then get this back together. Once I'm done with the time lapse, I'll show you the condition of all the rod bearings. Alright, so we got all 6 rod bearings done. All of them were in pretty good shape except for one. There was only one that was concerning. So here's 1 through 6. This is 1 and this is 6. So obviously cylinder number 5 is the worst. But that's not surprising because cylinder number 5 is the hottest cylinder. So it's most susceptible to rod bearing wear. But I Plasti-gauged it and it came out fine. So there was no scoring or anything on the actual crank, so I don't think there was any real damage, or I don't think the bearing was actually spun. So I think it was just worn down, but it's a good thing that we changed them. So fingers crossed we'll start this up and hopefully everything is fine. But that's pretty much how you change your rod bearing. So I definitely recommend the King bearings. They installed really easily and they fit almost like OEM, and they were all within spec on the Plasti-gauge. So if you haven't already, make sure you hit the subscribe button, drop a like on the video, and stay tuned for the rest of this build. I appreciate everybody who's watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting on the build. It's keeping me accountable to keep this thing going. It's a big project, the biggest project I've ever done, so I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching. I'm just really trying to show you